Hello my friends, today's video is going to be a making of on my latest image, the Lighthouse. So we are going to cover the making of process from conception to completion in this video. Before we get into that, I do want to mention that I do have a workshop coming up. So this is going to be a 6-week workshop on surreal composite photography. It's going to be an online workshop. And if you are interested in that, you may want to join my email list so that you will be the first to find out about it, since there will be a limited enrollment for that course. So if you are interested in that, make sure to check out the link to sign up for my email list in the description below. Now let's go ahead and get into the making of this image. So I like to start by talking about how I came up with these ideas, because I think this is a very important part of the process, and I think that it's something that we sometimes struggle with. So if you have been following my videos at all, you probably know that I've recently been getting pretty heavily into the work of the famous psychologist C.G. Jung. So recently, it was my birthday in July, and my husband got me a very cool present, which is a copy of Jung's Red Book. So if you're not sure what that is, it's very interesting because it's something where Jung explores sort of his artistic side, and it was something that came out of a period for him that was very difficult, and so he really wanted to delve into what was going on in his subconscious mind, and one of the ways that he did this was by creating these paintings and exploring the possible psychological meanings behind them. So I was thumbing through that book, and there's some really incredible imagery in it. I just want to show you a little drawing that I made that was kind of where this idea began. So I'm gonna just find it here in my notebook. Okay, so this is a drawing that I created sort of based on one of the images that I saw in the Red Book. And as you can see, it's pretty different from what the Lighthouse wound up being. And I actually still am planning to do something more in keeping with this. But the problem that I ran into is that I didn't really have an image of a tree that I felt was going to be suitable for this. Like, I really feel like this image needs a nice, epic, like sort of amazing looking tree. So I'm still kind of on the lookout for that. And one thing that I'm frequently doing is just going out and exploring and taking my camera with me and getting landscape images and images of trees and other natural objects that I think I may eventually be able to use in my composite photography. So this is something that I do on the regular in order to build my own stock library, because I prefer to use my own images in my composites. There are instances in which I don't, and this image is actually one of those. So there is one part to this image which I actually got off of a free stock photography site, and that is the actual lighthouse. I actually found a very cool image of a lighthouse on, I believe it was unsplash.com, and they have stock photography that is completely free for you to download and to use for any purposes, including commercial, which is pretty crazy. So that's where I got the Lighthouse image, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. So you can see my original idea kind of was totally different from what we wound up with here, but it did have a figure in fetal position. And as I was working on this, my idea kind of shifted, and I thought, well, what if I really liked this background. So let's take a look at just the background really quick here. This is the original background image that I started with, and this is an image which I took in the Santa Cruz area. So that's in Northern California, if you're not familiar. And it was just one of those days where you have these really cool cloud formations in the sky, and that always makes for amazing dramatic lighting. And I am all about dramatic lighting. This is something you'll see throughout my imagery. So I really wanted to use this as the background, but I knew it was going to be tricky because the lighting in this is very, very specific, and I knew it was going to require a lot of adjusting to get everything to fit together with this lighting. So originally I expanded my frame here, as you can see, and I just was really set on using that background. So what I decided to do was that I was going to, here I'm going to show you another image. This was kind of where I started from. So I was originally thinking that I would add like an eye, like a third eye on my forehead. And then I was thinking that maybe I would actually use a shot of myself with my eyes closed. So that was something that I was considering reshooting here. And then I would have a tree kind of growing off the top of my head, not in a dissimilar fashion to how the lighthouse is here. I wanted to make the top of the head look a little more like natural organic materials rather than, well, human materials are natural and organic, but landscape, I guess, materials rather than like human flesh, and then have a tree coming up out of that, a backlit tree. But as I was working on this, I kind of got stuck, and this is something that happens all the time, and it's totally fine. So I just wasn't sure if this was working for me, but I had actually had this idea that maybe I could shoot an image of me in the fetal position and actually place that here in the forehead like a third eye instead of using an actual eye. And so I had already shot this fetal position image of myself, and I was playing around with that. And when I realized that I just really, really liked this shot of my figure in the fetal position, and that I just wanted to find a way to use that. And I had that in this other file at some point, but maybe it got removed. So that was kind of how this all started. So what I wound up doing was, I'm just gonna close those. What I wound up doing was totally changing the idea, because as I was playing around with this figure, I really wanted that to be the underwater part. And then I thought, well, why don't I just use my back as sort of the landscape that's rising up out of the water? And so that's kind of where this started. And then the lighthouse idea very specifically came out of something that I was reading in Jung, where he was referencing the symbol of the lighthouse. And I was like, I could put a lighthouse, you know, it's an ocean shot. So it makes perfect sense for me to have this sort of landmass rising up out of the water with a lighthouse on it. And then this coral piece here, which is very much shaped like a brain, in my opinion. So let's see if we can find just the coral so you can get a better look at that. We'll have to turn off the mask. So this piece of coral that I got in Monterey, which is another place in Morro Bay, which is actually in Central California, at a shell shop that they have there. I think it looks like a human brain. So that was actually why I bought it, because I just thought that was so cool how much it looked like a human brain. So I use this in a lot of my images, and in this particular series that I've been working on, it pops up again and again and again, which is great because it gives the series a sort of continuity that it needs to be a series, right? So I decided that what I would do was have this, I don't know if it's going to turn everything on this time. Oh, it did it. Okay, there we go. Was just have this piece of coral sort of floating in the water here, and the light from the lighthouse would be shining on that. And for me, the coral is symbolic of the human mind in different incarnations. I just wanted to go over the basic idea first so you know where we're headed, and then we can go into the studio and I can show you how I set up the lighting and how I shot the individual pieces. We are now in my garage studio where I will be shooting the elements for our scene. And I've actually already shot everything. So basically what I'm going to be doing here is just kind of going over with you the lighting setups that I used, because to me, I think that's a pretty important part of the process. And personally, when I've watched other tutorials and on photography and on the whole compositing process, one thing that I frequently find lacking is that they never really go over lighting. And lighting is something that is more complicated and also more simple than we sometimes realize, simply because we may not have the knowledge surrounding all of the aspects of lighting a scene. So I keep my lighting setups very simple, as you may already know if you follow a lot of my videos. And but I still think that you probably want to know how I'm going about lighting things. Now, as far as things like camera settings go, now I'm not really concerned with that. And the reason is that they don't matter. Like, as long as you understand what ISO is and how that's going to affect the appearance of your image, what f-stop is, or aperture, and how that's going to affect the appearance of your image, what shutter speed is and how that's going to affect the appearance of your image, and how these three things work together to create your exposure, it doesn't really matter what my specific settings are when I'm shooting, right? The only thing you really need to know is, what am I going for? Well, I'm going to tell you that I'm going for depth of field. That's my number one concern. So shutter speed and ISO don't matter too much to me. Obviously, I don't want to crank my ISO up so high that I'm going to get a crazy grainy image or anything like that. But my camera can handle a very high ISO without creating too much grain in the image. So for me, as a little rule of thumb, I typically try not to shoot over ISO 3200 for images like this, though that is not always the case. There are situations where I will, but it's because my camera can handle that and that it won't be all that grainy. But if you have a camera that can't, well, you need to take that into consideration. But aside from the depth of field, which is all really going to be more or less based on the f-stop that I'm choosing, and also how far away my camera is from my subject, and the focal length of the lens as well. Those all factor in to depth of field. But I'm not gonna go into that because that's all like sort of camera 101 or photography 101 type information that we're not really covering here. But for these images, I'm mostly gonna stick around f16 if I can. Maybe I'll drop it down to like f11 if there's not enough light for that. But I don't really want to go wider than f8. And that's because I want to preserve as much depth of field as possible throughout this entire image. And that's typically the case in most of my composites. Not all. There are composites that I've made where I have had some more shallow depth of field, but it is going to be a lot more tricky for you to play around with bringing in different elements from different scenes if you're using a shallow depth of field. So that's what I've got to say about camera settings. The rest is all about lighting. So let's get started, and I'll just show you how I set up the lighting for each of the shots that I took that we'll be bringing in to Photoshop for our composite. So here we have our first lighting setup that will be for the figure in our scene. And what I've done here is I've set up a stool, and then I've just placed some apple boxes on that so you can see where I would be sitting for this. So I would just be kind of curled up here in my fetal position, or like a child's pose if you're familiar with that. And then this gives me a sense of where to place my camera, which is right directly out in front of this. I just want like a nice straight shot of this. I don't want it to be really angled up or down. I just want it right straight looking at the figure. So I've placed my camera on the ground in front of me here. You should be able to see it, but just in case you can't, it's right here. So it's very low to the ground. And then I have my light. So I'm just using one light for this. This is my Godox 60 watt mono light. It's a continuous lighting source. I typically always use continuous lighting sources. I don't really have any strobes. And I have a 36-inch octabox on that to create a nice soft lighting. And I've chosen to place it directly out in front of my figure because I want a nice even light. So I'm okay with it being a soft light, even though the above water portion of this scene has a little bit more of a mixture of soft and hard lighting. But the underwater part should probably be pretty soft because the light's being diffused there. And this is really just the part of the image where there's no real right answer for exactly how the lighting should look on that, but I think that with the lighting effects that we add to the image and just doing a nice soft even lighting will work perfectly. It'll be great. So that's why I chose to place my light just directly out in front, put the softbox on that, and I'm trying to push it back as far as I can. I want it close enough to my subject that I'm going to get it bright enough, because I do need to make sure that I'm not pumping my ISO on my camera up too high, but I want to push it back as far as I can because that's just going to distribute the light even more and give me more of that even light quality. So that's really it. Super, super simple. And then I would just get into position here, grab my trigger and take a few shots. And that's it. We're done with this one. We can move on to the next. We're now set up to do the next part of our scene. So what I'm going to be doing now is photographing the plants in the scene. So you'll notice that at the bottom of the image, there are these sort of water plants coming up and slightly covering the figure. And that's what this little thing is right here. So I got this at a Hobby Lobby, I think. It's just some kind of fake plant that they had in their fake flowers section. I don't know what it is, but I thought it looked like something that might be an underwater plant, so that's why I got it. And then what I did was I actually pulled these little pieces off. You can see there's like, you might not be able to see because I think this is kind of a wide shot, but there's these little nubs where I actually pulled these off of here so that I could put them in this stand that I have here. So I can't remember what this thing is called, but essentially it's meant for holding like reflectors and things like that. But it has these little clips on it, so I can really use it to hold pretty much anything. And this arm moves up and down. So I've just placed the arm straight out and I've clamped one of these pieces in there so that I can arrange it in a way that will work for the shot that I'm trying to create here. And I just want it straight up and down, so that's how I put it in there. And then I have a whole bunch more of these, so I'm gonna photograph several of them in this exact same way. Now, as far as the lighting goes, so I have my V-flats set up and that's gonna be our background. So I didn't want to have to take down my gray backdrop and put up a white one because that's just a whole process. So instead I decided to just use my V-flats as the background because this is going to be a pretty tight shot anyways. I'm using my 100mm lens here. So in the previous shot of the figure, I was using a 50mm because I needed to get more of the scene in that shot. But this one, I want a nice tight shot. I want to get as much resolution on this tiny little object as I can. So the 100mm is definitely the choice here. And so for the lighting, I'm just using these exact same lights. So I have 3 60 watt Godox mono lights. One is our main light, which I'll talk about in a second, and two are our background lights. So on either side here, I've just set these two up with nothing but the 7-inch reflector on those. And the only reason I'm even really using that is just to control the spill of light. If I was to take that off, the light would kind of just spill all over the room. And I don't want any of the light that's hitting that background to hit my subject. So as you can see, I've really pulled my subject forward off of that background so that I'm not getting too much reflected light. There's going to be some, but if you have it really close to it, you'll get this sort of white halo around everything, and I don't want that. But what I do want is a nice even lighting on this background, and I want to be able to blow this background completely out. I want it solid, solid white with absolutely no detail, because this is going to make it a lot easier for me to select this in Photoshop. Something like this, it's just a tiny little piece of plant life. It's got like these fuzzy little edges on it. It's gonna be really tricky to select that in Photoshop and have it look nice and natural, and we're definitely gonna have to do a little bit of work to clean up that selection. But if we use this solid, solid white background, it's going to make it so much easier to select. And that is why I'm setting up the lights like this. So if you didn't have 3 lights, say you only had 2, you could use just one on the background, but you would need to find a way to like get a C-stand and boom that light out over the background here so that it would kind of be centered on it, because the idea is that this needs to be even. So if you only have one light and you set it off to the side, it's not really going to be even. It's going to be brighter on one side than the other. Does that mean that you absolutely can't make it work? No, but it's just going to make it a little harder on you. So that's why I have 2 lights here and one on either side so that it's really getting a nice even light back there on that background. And then for our main light, again, we have the Godox 60 watt mono light, and I have my 36-inch octabox on that. So this is the exact same light that I used in the shoot of the figure. And I want the same lighting on this, right? It's also underwater with the figure. I want that same nice even lighting. So one thing that I do want to point out is that it's important when you're trying to get a solid white background that you pull your subject off of that background as far as you can. That way you're really lighting the background and the subject separately. And then the other thing that's important is that you have to get your exposure to a point where it's going to blow out that background. So you need to be able to raise your exposure enough to get a solid white background. And that means that you don't want to have your main lighting source on your subject so close to that subject that it's going to make it so that the subject itself is also blown out, right? We don't want that. We want the subject to be at a nice, perfect exposure. And we want the background to be blown out. So what I've done is I've shoved my light as far back as it can go. It's all the way up against the garage door here so that I can make sure that I won't be getting my subject too bright in order to brighten up that background. So I hope that makes sense. But I'll tell you my settings on this one just because it's a slightly more complicated shot. It's f/22, ISO 3200, and 1/20th of a second shutter speed. So f/22 is, like I said, I'm going for depth of field. And this is a small thing, and I'm probably gonna bring my camera in even closer to it for a few shots. So you got that 100mm lens on there. That's already going to diminish your depth of field a little bit. And then you bring it closer to the subject, you're diminishing it even further. So f/22 was the right choice here. And then the shutter speed really is just how bright I need everything to be. And I don't want to pump my ISO up crazy, crazy high. So I chose 1/20th of a second. Let me just see here, as I bump my head, if I'm right about the ISO on this. Yes, it is ISO 3200. So that created, and I always test. So I took a test shot and I looked at it and I looked at the histogram. When you look at the histogram for this, you do want to see that some of the information on the histogram is pushed all the way over to the right-hand side, indicating that there are parts of that image that are blown out, because that's what you want for the background, right? So that's how you can kind of check to make sure that you are getting that really white background. And also just look at it. I zoom in on it. I make sure that I'm still getting plenty of detail on my subject and that looks nice and white. And if it's not totally perfect, that's okay, as long as it's close enough. And that's it. So we're just going to take a whole bunch of different pieces and swap them out here, because I want a variety of sort of just different little details in the appearance of these so that they will look natural, right? And then we'll take probably, I'll do about 15 to 20 shots of these, and we'll be ready to move on. We're now ready for our final setup of the day. So this is going to be for the shot of the coral, and the lighting has changed quite a bit here because the coral is kind of special because it's being lit by the lighthouse, right? The light from the lighthouse is shining directly down onto the coral. So essentially I'm just replicating what that should be like-ish, right? So right over here, I have one of my Godox lights, the same lights we've been using the whole time. What I've done is I have put a 20-degree grid inside of the reflector on that because I want to create more of a spotlight effect, since the lighthouse is kind of a very precise light, right? Which is shining in an almost spotlight fashion. So the grids will allow you to focus your light essentially to different degrees. So the one that I chose is a 20 degree. I think that'll work just fine. And I brought it in close because I do want it to have that effect of the light from the lighthouse really being very bright and the rest not so bright. But at the same time, I don't want the shadows here to get so dark that I don't see any detail whatsoever. So because of that, I've placed my light with the softbox on it over here, and it's just providing a little bit of fill light. And I have it turned down pretty low. I think I have it set to about 45% brightness. So it's just going to fill in those shadows so that we still get the detail that we want, but we get the effect of that spotlight. And that's really it for this image. I've put my apple boxes here on top of a stool. That's where I'm setting the coral. And I put this black cover over that because I want more contrast here. So the color of the apple boxes, it's not white, but it's closer to white. So it'll be better for selecting purposes to have this black surface that it's sitting on. And that's really it. I'm still using my 100mm for this because I want as much resolution on this as possible. It did end up being quite small in the scene, but I never really know. Things change, so I want to make sure that I have the option, if I wanted to make it huge, right? So that's why I try to get as much resolution on these objects as I possibly can, and it's just going to increase the quality of your imagery in general, especially if you're printing. That's really when these things become important. So my settings haven't really changed much. I think I've still got f22 and 1/30th of a second now, and still ISO 3200. So that's it. I'm just going to take a few shots, and typically what I'll do is I'll rotate the object around a little bit just to get a few different angles on it. I do want pretty much just a straight on shot. I don't want it angled up or angled down at it. I just kind of want it straight on at the coral. And that's how I have the camera set up. So we'll just take a few shots, and then we will finally have all of the elements for our scene, and we can go ahead and begin building this composite in Photoshop. Okay, my friends, so this video has gotten a little longer than I anticipated, so I'm actually going to break this up into 2 parts, and in the next part we will go over the Photoshop editing process. So look out for that probably next week. And in the meantime, let me know in the comments if you have any questions about any of the lighting setups or anything that we talked about in this video. And if there's anything that you'd like to hear more information about, I'm always open to your suggestions so that I can improve my future videos and make sure that I'm getting you the content that you're interested in. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video.